The longships appeared without warning. That was always the point. Out of the grey northern sea, low-hulled and fast, cutting through the morning fog before the monks on the shore had time to ring the bell. It was June 793 on a small island off the northeast coast of England called Lindisfarne, a place so holy that pilgrims had walked hundreds of miles just to stand on its soil. And in the space of a single morning, everything the people of Christian Europe thought they understood about their world shifted on its axis. We have a record of what happened, written by a scholar named Alcuin, who was in the court of Charlemagne when the news reached him. He called it a catastrophe without precedent. He wrote of the pagans desecrating sacred places, of the community shattered, of a horror that seemed to come from nowhere. Never before, he wrote, has such terror appeared in Britain. But here is what Alcuin did not know, what no one in Europe could have known in that moment, was that this was not a beginning. It was not even close to a beginning. The people who arrived at Lindisfarne that morning had been building toward this for generations. They had shipbuilding traditions stretching back centuries. They had trade networks that already reached from Scandinavia into the heart of the continent. They had a complex, layered culture with poetry and lore and mythology and craftsmanship so refined it still takes your breath away in museum cases more than 1,000 years later. What the monks of Lindisfarne encountered on that June morning was not a horde of savages descending from the darkness. It was the visible edge of an entire civilization, one that had been quietly developing in the north, while the rest of Europe was busy collapsing and rebuilding after Rome. And that gap between what Europeans believed about the Vikings and what the Vikings actually were is one of the most fascinating and consequential misunderstandings in all of human history. So let us go back, not to 793, but further, to the world that made the Vikings possible. Scandinavia in the early medieval period was not a single kingdom, not a unified culture, not even a single ethnic group in any meaningful sense. It was a collection of communities spread across an enormous and geographically brutal landscape, Norway's western coastline, a labyrinth of fjords and mountains that made overland travel nearly impossible. Sweden's eastern shores, oriented toward the Baltic Sea and the river systems that led deep into what is now Russia. Denmark's flatter southern peninsula, sitting at the crossroads between the North Sea and the continent. The geography shaped everything. When your land is mostly rock and forest and coastline, when the growing season is short and the winters are long, you develop a particular relationship with the sea. The sea is not an obstacle, the sea is the road, and the people of Scandinavia had been learning to read that road for a very long time. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Norse were building sophisticated watercraft as far back as the Bronze Age, more than 2,000 years before Lindisfarne. By the time the Viking Age properly begins, they had refined their shipbuilding to a level that was, by any honest assessment, the most advanced in the world. The longship is worth pausing on, because it is genuinely extraordinary and because it is so central to everything that follows. Modern reconstructions and experimental archaeology have taught us things about these vessels that the people who wrote about Vikings in the medieval period simply could not appreciate. A Viking longship was not heavy. It was almost impossibly light. The hull so shallow that it could navigate rivers only a meter deep, yet stable enough to cross the open Atlantic. The keel was flexible, designed to bend rather than break in heavy seas. The overlapping planks, a construction technique called clinker building, gave the hull a kind of organic resilience that riveted planks could not match. A well-built longship could cross the North Sea in 3 days. It could be carried overland between rivers. It could be beached directly on a shore without a harbor. It was, in the language of military history, a force projection tool of the first order, and no one else in the world had anything like it. But here is the first thing that tends to get lost in the popular image of the Vikings. The longship was not primarily a warship. The same technology that enabled raids also enabled trade. The same vessels that carried warriors to Lindisfarne carried merchants to the markets of Hedeby and Birka and Ryby, the great trading towns of the Viking world. The same people who could appear without warning on a monastery's shore were also, in many contexts, the most traveled and commercially sophisticated traders in medieval Europe. This is the central paradox of the Vikings, and it is not really a paradox at all once you understand the context. The Norse did not divide the world neatly into trading and raiding. They were opportunists, in the most precise sense of the word, people who read situations and responded to whatever offered the best return. A wealthy, undefended monastery. That was an opportunity. A town that wanted to trade amber and furs for silver and silk. Also an opportunity. a land with good soil and no strong central authority to resist settlers. Another opportunity entirely. The word Viking, incidentally, is itself contested. It appears in Old Norse sources as vikinga, and its meaning is not entirely settled among scholars. One interpretation connects it to vik, meaning a bay or inlet. A Viking, on this reading, is someone who lurks in inlets, which fits the raiding context. Another interpretation connects it to the Old English wic, meaning a trading camp. Some scholars believe it simply meant something like expedition or sea voyage. What is reasonably clear is that it was not an ethnic term. Not every Norse person was a Viking. A Viking was someone who went on a particular kind of seaborne venture, and many Norse people never did. When we say the Vikings, we are using a shorthand that flattens an enormous diversity of people, places, and activities across roughly 3 centuries. The Norwegian who settled Iceland in the 870s, the Swede who traveled down the Volga to trade with the Abbasid Caliphate, the Dane who besieged Paris in 885, the Norseman who established a colony in Newfoundland around the year 1000. These people shared a language family and some cultural touchstones, but their worlds were extraordinarily different. Let us talk about what those worlds actually looked like. Norse society in the Viking Age was organized around a concept that does not translate perfectly into modern terms, the concept of honor. Not honor in the abstract, sentimental sense we sometimes use today, but honor as a concrete social currency, something that could be accumulated, spent, lost, and avenged. Your standing in your community depended on your reputation, your generosity, your willingness to defend what was yours, and your ability to fulfill your obligations to those who depended on you. At the top of this social structure were the Jarls, powerful chieftains who commanded loyalty through a combination of wealth, military prowess, and the ability to distribute rewards to their followers. Below them were the Carls, free farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of Norse society. At the bottom were the thralls, enslaved people, a category that the Viking Age both perpetuated and, in many ways, depended upon. Slavery is one of the aspects of Norse culture that popular media tends to skip over, but it was economically central. Raids often had the acquisition of slaves as a primary objective, and the slave trade connected the Norse world to markets as far away as the Islamic caliphates. Women in Norse society occupied a position that was, by medieval standards, relatively, though not unconditionally, significant. There is genuine archaeological evidence of women buried with weapons, and the legal codes of Scandinavian societies gave women property rights and the ability to initiate divorce that their counterparts in much of Christian Europe did not have. The figure of the shield maiden appears in Norse sagas, and while historians debate how literally to read these accounts, recent archaeological work has complicated the old assumption that all warrior burials were male. A famous burial at Birka in Sweden, long assumed to be a male warrior because of the weapons and horse interred with the body, was revealed by DNA analysis in 2017 to be biologically female. What exactly this means, whether this individual was a warrior, a leader, or something else entirely, remains a subject of genuine scholarly discussion. But it is a reminder that our assumptions about the past are often exactly that, assumptions. The religious world of the pre-Christian Norse is another area where popular culture has both simplified and, in some ways, genuinely distorted the picture. The mythology that comes down to us, the Eddas, compiled in Iceland in the 13th century, centuries after the conversion to Christianity, gives us Odin and Thor and Loki and the great cosmological drama of Ragnarok. These are real texts, and they preserve real elements of pre-Christian Norse belief. But they were written down by Christian authors, filtered through Christian frameworks, and we should be cautious about treating them as a straightforward window into what a Norse farmer or warrior in 850 actually believed. What we can say with more confidence is that Norse religion was polytheistic and deeply connected to the natural world, to fate, and to the cycle of life and death. Sacrifice of animals, of objects, and in some documented cases of humans was part of the ritual landscape. The concept of Valhalla, the hall of slain warriors, where Odin gathered the honored dead to prepare for the final battle of Ragnarok, was not simply a comfort myth. It was a framework that gave meaning to violent death in a world where violent death was a realistic prospect for many people. If you died well, bravely, in battle, your death was not a waste. It was a contribution to something larger. This is important context for understanding why the Viking Age looked the way it did from the outside. a culture that had developed a sophisticated theology around the value of bold action, risk-taking, and honorable death was going to produce a particular kind of person when conditions created opportunities for expansion, and conditions absolutely did create those opportunities. This is perhaps the most underappreciated factor in the story of the Viking Age. The timing was not accidental. The late 8th century, when the raids began in earnest, was a period of significant instability across Europe. The Carolingian Empire, the great Frankish state built by Charlemagne, was powerful but stretched thin, and its coastlines were not well defended. England was a patchwork of competing kingdoms with no unified defense. Ireland was similarly fragmented. The monasteries that the Norse targeted were not just spiritually significant, they were economically significant. They were where wealth accumulated in a world without banks. They held gold and silver plate, jeweled manuscripts, fine cloth, and of course people who could be taken as slaves. From a purely strategic standpoint, they were the most attractive targets in the landscape. At the same time, there were internal pressures within Scandinavia, pushing people outward. Population growth, combined with the inheritance customs that concentrated land in the hands of eldest sons, meant that younger sons had limited options at home. The political consolidation happening in Scandinavia, particularly in Norway, where Harald Fairhair was gradually centralizing power in the late 9th century, created a class of displaced chieftains and their followers who needed new opportunities. The Viking Age was, in this sense, not simply a story of aggression. It was a story of people responding rationally to the incentives and pressures of their world. That does not make the violence less real or less consequential for the people who experienced it, but it does make the Vikings comprehensible in a way that the savage raiders from the North narrative does not. Now, here is one of the facts about the Viking world that genuinely stops people when they hear it for the first time. The Norse reached North America roughly 500 years before Columbus. This is not speculation. It is not legend. It is archaeology. At Lance O Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland in Canada, excavations beginning in the 1960s revealed the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. Turf longhouses, a smithy with iron slag, a bronze cloak pin of distinctly Norse design. The site has been radiocarbon dated to around the year 1000, and it corresponds closely to the saga's accounts of a place called Vinland, reached by Leif Erikson after he heard reports from a sailor named Bjarni Herjolfsson who had been blown off course. The settlement at Lance O Meadows appears to have been occupied for only a short time, perhaps a decade or two. The sagas describe conflicts with the indigenous people they called Skraelings, and the Norse eventually withdrew. They did not establish a permanent colony. But the fact of the contact is real, and it is a remarkable thing. A pre-industrial society, navigating by the stars and the color of the water and the behavior of birds, crossed the North Atlantic in open wooden boats and made landfall on a continent that the rest of the world would not discover for another half millennium. The Atlantic was not, in fact, the first ocean the Norse crossed. The story of Norse expansion in the West is a stepping stone story that begins in the late 8th century with the settlement of the Faroe Islands, continues in the 870s with the settlement of Iceland, an island that Norse settlers found largely uninhabited, though Irish monks had been there before them, and then in the 980s with Eric the Red's exploration and colonization of Greenland. Greenland is worth a moment's attention because it is one of the more poignant stories in all of Norse history. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter. A man who seemed constitutionally incapable of avoiding trouble sailed west and found a large island that was, in its southern coastal areas, genuinely habitable. He called it Greenland, and the sagas tell us, with what feels like historical accuracy, that he chose the name deliberately to attract settlers. It worked. The Greenland Norse colony survived for nearly 500 years, maintaining a remarkable outpost of European culture at the edge of the known world before finally disappearing in the 15th century under circumstances that historians still debate: climate change, the Little Ice Age, economic isolation, conflict with the Inuit, perhaps all of these together. But let us turn east now, because the Western expansion, dramatic as it is, represents only one direction of Norse energy. The Varangian story, the Norse expansion into the east, is in some ways even more astonishing, and it is far less well known in the popular imagination. The Swedes, and to a lesser extent other Norse groups, had been trading into the Baltic and along the rivers of what is now Russia since at least the 8th century. The great river systems of Eastern Europe, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, were the highways of this world, and the Norse, with their shallow draft boats that could be portaged overland between river systems, were uniquely positioned to exploit them. What they found at the end of these rivers was a world of staggering wealth. The Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, was at this period the most economically sophisticated civilization on earth. Its merchants wanted furs and amber and slaves. The Norse had furs and amber and slaves. The result was a trade network of extraordinary reach. Norse silver hoards found in Scandinavia contained thousands of Abbasid dirhams, Arabic coins that traveled north along the Volga route in exchange for goods from the forests of the north. Along the way, the Norse established trading posts and, eventually, something more. The city of Novgorod, one of the most important cities in Russian history, has a name that means new town in Slavic, but its founding is associated in the chronicles with a Norse leader called Rurik, who was invited, according to the primary chronicle, by the local Slavic tribes to come and rule over them because they were unable to govern themselves. Whether this account is literally true is debated. It has the feel of a founding myth, but the archaeological evidence for a strong Norse presence in the founding of the early Rus's state is substantial. The word Rus itself is almost certainly of Norse origin, probably derived from a Finnish word for the Norse, ruotsi, which in turn likely comes from an Old Norse word related to rowing. The people who would eventually become the Russians take their name, at least in part, from Scandinavian traders and settlers who came down the rivers 1,000 years ago. This is the second fact that tends to produce genuine astonishment. The founding mythology of Russia, Ukraine and Belarus is intertwined with the Norse world. The Varangian Rus established a dynasty, the Rurikids, that ruled in Kiev and Novgorod for centuries, and the cultural and political legacy of that founding is woven into the deep history of Eastern Europe. The Norse also reached Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, which they called Miklagarthra, the Great City. Byzantine emperors, recognizing the military quality of these northern warriors, recruited them as elite personal guards, the Varangian Guard, which protected the emperor and participated in Byzantine military campaigns for centuries. There is a runic inscription carved into the marble railing of the Hagia Sophia, one of the most sacred buildings in the Byzantine world, that reads in part, Halfdan carved these runes. A Norse soldier bored during a ceremony, scratching his name into the marble of the greatest church in Christendom. History sometimes has a wry sense of humor. Meanwhile, back in Western Europe, the relationship between the Norse world and the Christian kingdoms was evolving in ways that complicate the simple raider narrative still further. The Danes who settled in northern and eastern England, the area that came to be called the Danelaw, did not simply raid and leave. They settled. They farmed. They traded. They intermarried with the local population. The English language carries the marks of this contact to this day. Words like sky, window, husband, knife, egg, ugly, happy, wrong, all of these are of Norse origin. The place names of northern England are full of Norse elements. The suffix by, meaning farm or village, thwaite, meaning clearing, thorpe, meaning hamlet. You cannot drive through Yorkshire without encountering the Norse past at every signpost. The settlement of Normandy, the region of northern France whose name literally means land of the Northmen, is another example of this transformative settlement dynamic. A Norse leader named Rollo, having raided along the Seine, was granted land in what is now Normandy by the Frankish king Charles the Simple in 911, in exchange for a promise to defend the region from further Viking attacks and to convert to Christianity. Rollo's descendants, within a few generations, had become thoroughly French in language and culture, and it was Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, William, who conquered England in 1066. The Norman conquest of England is, in a real sense, the last act of the Viking Age. The same Norse energy that had been disrupting Europe for nearly 3 centuries found its final expression in the most consequential invasion in English history. William the Conqueror was, by blood and culture, a Frenchman. But the chain of causation that put him on the throne of England runs directly back to the longships on the Seine. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity is the other great transformation of this period, and it happened faster than you might expect. By the year 1000, the Norse kings of Norway and Denmark had officially adopted Christianity. Not necessarily out of deep personal conviction, though that varied, but because Christianity was the religion of the powerful kingdoms to the south, and adopting it opened doors, diplomatic marriages, trade relationships, the legitimacy that came from being part of the Christian community of nations. Iceland converted in the year 1000 as well, through a remarkable process. The Althing, the Icelandic parliament, one of the oldest in the world, voted on the matter, and a pagan law speaker named Orgira Alojvetningagothi retired under his cloak for a day and a night to think it over, then emerged and declared that Iceland would be Christian. This conversion did not mean the immediate disappearance of Norse culture. The myth survived, at least in memory. The legal traditions survived, the poetry survived. Iceland, in particular, became a repository of Norse literary culture precisely because its relative isolation and its strong tradition of written law meant that things got written down. The sagas, those extraordinary prose narratives that combine history, legend, family drama, and something that reads almost like a novel, were composed in Iceland in the 12th and 13th centuries, long after the Viking Age proper had ended. They are our richest window into the Norse world, and they are also literary creations shaped by the Christian literate culture of their authors. Reading them requires holding both things in mind at once. Now, here is the third fact, the one that reframes everything. The image of the Vikings that dominated European and later American popular culture for much of the 19th and 20th centuries was almost entirely invented in the 19th century. The horned helmet, the single most iconic image associated with Vikings in popular culture, has essentially no basis in the archaeological record of the Viking Age. Actual Norse helmets, of which very few survive, are rounded iron caps, sometimes with a nose guard. The famous Gudmund helmet, found in Norway and dating to the 10th century, looks nothing like what you see in movies. The horned helmets that appear in Viking imagery come from a combination of sources. Genuine Bronze Age Scandinavian helmets that predate the Viking Age by more than 1,000 years, and the creative imagination of 19th century Romantic artists and costume designers who were constructing a mythology of Nordic heroism for political and cultural purposes. The 19th century was the period of nationalism, and in Scandinavia, as elsewhere, nationalist movements needed founding myths. The Norse past was conscripted into service. Scholars like NFS. Grundtvig in Denmark and artists across the region created a vision of the Viking as a symbol of Northern European vitality, freedom, and martial virtue. This vision was powerful, it was beautiful in its way, and it was substantially fictional. The problem became acute in the 20th century when elements of this Norse mythology were adopted by the most destructive political movement in modern history. The Nazis were fascinated by Norse symbolism, the runic alphabet, the mythology, the idea of a superior northern race. This appropriation has left a complicated legacy that Norse scholars and enthusiasts still navigate. The Norse past belongs to history, not to any political movement, but the shadow of that appropriation is real and it is worth acknowledging. The truth about the Vikings, the actual historical truth, is in many ways more interesting than the myth. It is the story of people who were simultaneously traders and raiders, explorers and settlers, poets and warriors. It is the story of a culture that produced the most advanced ships of its age, crossed 3 oceans, founded cities, shaped languages, and left its mark on the DNA and the place names and the legal traditions of half the world. It is also the story of a culture that practiced slavery on a significant scale, that inflicted real suffering on communities from Ireland to Russia, that was capable of extraordinary violence as well as extraordinary artistry. The Norse were not heroes, they were not villains, they were people, complicated, capable, shaped by their world and shaping it in turn. Let us spend a moment with the archaeology, because it is genuinely revelatory and because it has done more than anything else in the last half-century to correct the distorted picture. The great ship burials are the most dramatic evidence. At Gokstad and Oseberg in Norway, excavations revealed longships buried with their owners in the 9th century. Not just the ships, but everything that went with them: sledges, beds, cooking equipment, textiles, animals, and in the case of Oseberg, 2 women buried together with a level of grave goods that suggests extraordinary status. The Oseberg ship itself is one of the most beautiful objects to survive from the medieval world. Intricately carved, perfectly preserved in the blue clay of the burial mound, a testament to the skill of the craftspeople who built it. The Oseberg tapestries, fragmentary, but reconstructed, show scenes of ritual procession, wagons, figures that may be gods or priests, a visual world of extraordinary complexity. These are not the artifacts of a culture without inner life. These are the artifacts of a culture with a rich, sophisticated symbolic vocabulary that we are still learning to read. The runestones of Sweden are another layer of this world. Hundreds of them survive, carved with the angular Norse alphabet and often commemorating the dead, particularly those who died far from home. He fell in the east, many of them say. He went to England. He died in Circland, the Arabic world. These are memorials, and they give us something the chronicles of hostile outsiders cannot: the Norse perspective on their own world, the things they valued, the people they mourned. The trading towns are equally revelatory. Hedeby, in what is now northern Germany, was one of the great commercial centers of the Viking Age, a cosmopolitan place where Norse merchants mixed with Frankish traders, Slavic craftspeople, and Arab merchants. The archaeological remains show a town of wooden buildings laid out along planned streets, with evidence of metalworking, textile production, comb-making from antler, and trade goods from across the known world. This is not a raiders' camp. This is a city. Birka in Sweden was another such center, and its cemetery has produced some of the most important recent findings in Norse archaeology, including that warrior burial whose DNA analysis revealed a biological female. The Birka graves show a community in contact with the Byzantine world, the Islamic world, and the Frankish world simultaneously. They show people who wore silk from China and carried silver from Central Asia and buried their dead, with a combination of Norse and foreign goods that reflects a genuinely cosmopolitan existence. The picture that emerges from the archaeology is of a world far more connected, far more commercially sophisticated, and far more culturally complex than the Viking raiders image allows for. What, then, is the legacy of the Viking Age? What did those 3 centuries of Norse activity actually change? The most obvious legacy is geographical. The Norse settled Iceland, which has been continuously inhabited ever since, and which produced, in the medieval period, a literary and legal culture of remarkable sophistication. They settled Greenland, which they held for 5 centuries. They reached North America, which they did not hold but which they reached. These are facts of exploration that stand alongside anything in the age of European expansion that came later. The political legacy is equally significant. The Rurikid dynasty that the Norse established in the east became the founding dynasty of the Kievan Rus, the political entity from which the modern states of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus all claim descent. The Normans, descendants of Norse settlers in France, conquered England in 1066 and reshaped its language, its law, its aristocracy, and its culture in ways that are still visible today. The English common law tradition, the English language itself, with its vast Norse component, the very structure of English place names, all of these bear the mark of the Norse encounter. The commercial legacy is less celebrated, but equally real. The Norse trade networks connected the Baltic world to the Mediterranean world, and to the Islamic world in ways that facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and people across an enormous geography. The silver that flowed north from the Islamic world in exchange for Norse trade goods was one of the economic foundations of early medieval Scandinavia. The demand for furs and amber that the Norse supplied helped shape the economic geography of northern Europe for centuries. And then there is the cultural legacy, the hardest to measure and perhaps the most enduring. The Norse myths, preserved in Iceland and rediscovered by European romantics in the 18th and 19th centuries, became one of the foundations of modern fantasy literature. Tolkien drew deeply on Norse mythology for The Lord of the Rings, the dwarves, the elves, the cosmological framework, the language of the runes. The days of the week in English still carry Norse gods. Tuesday is Tyr's Day, Wednesday is Woden's Day, Thursday is Thor's Day, Friday is Freya's Day. The Norse gods are so embedded in the English-speaking world's temporal framework that we invoke them every week without noticing. The image of the Viking, even the distorted 19th century romantic image, has become one of the most powerful cultural archetypes in the modern world. It speaks to something about the appeal of the explorer, the outsider, the person who goes beyond the known horizon. That appeal is not wrong, even if the specific image is historically inaccurate. The actual Norse were, in fact, extraordinary explorers. They did go beyond the known horizon. They did cross seas that no one else had crossed. The myth, at its core, points towards something real. What it gets wrong is the simplicity. The real Vikings were not simply warriors. They were not simply raiders. They were not simply anything. They were people navigating a complex world with the tools and values and pressures of their time, and they navigated it with a skill and a reach that still commands genuine admiration more than 1,000 years later. There is a moment I keep returning to when I think about the Viking Age. It is not a battle. It is not a raid. It is a runestone in Sweden, carved sometime in the 11th century, commemorating a man named Ulf, who had collected tribute in England 3 times, once under a leader named Tosti, once under a leader named Thorkel, once under Knut himself, the Danish king who became King of England, 3 separate expeditions to England, 3 collections of tribute, and then someone, probably a family member, paid to have a stone carved to remember him. Ulf is not a famous figure. He is not in the sagas. He is a working man of the Viking Age, someone who went on expeditions, collected silver, came home, and eventually died. And the person who commemorated him thought it was worth recording. He went to England. He brought back silver. He served great men. He was here. That is the Viking Age in miniature. Not the mythology, not the horned helmets, not the pure violence or the pure heroism. Just people, going out into a world of risk and opportunity, trying to come home with something to show for it. The truth about the Vikings is that they were human, fully, completely, complicatedly human, and that is, in the end, the most interesting thing about them. If this story has shifted something in how you think about the Norse world, I would genuinely love to know. Leave a comment below. Tell me what surprised you most, or what you want to know more about. There is so much more to explore here. The saga literature, the specific stories of individual Norse expeditions, the archaeology of individual sites, the question of what the people the Norse encountered actually thought of them. Every one of those threads leads somewhere fascinating. If you are new here, this channel is built on the idea that history is most interesting when it is told honestly, when we resist the simple story in favor of the complicated truth. Subscribe if that sounds like the kind of history you want to spend time with. And if you want to stay in the Norse world a little longer, the next video goes deep on the Varangian Guard, the Norse warriors who became the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors, who fought from Constantinople to Sicily to the edges of the known world, and who left their names carved in the marble of the Hagia Sophia. That story is waiting for you. The Varangian Guard deserves that full treatment. But before we get there, let us linger a little longer in the world the Norse actually inhabited day to day, because the gap between the dramatic set pieces of Viking history and the texture of ordinary Norse life is where some of the most revealing truths are hiding. Consider the farm. The overwhelming majority of Norse people in the Viking Age were farmers, not warriors, not merchants, not explorers. Farmers who got up before dawn, worked the short northern growing season with everything they had, and spent the long winters doing the things that winter demanded, repairing tools, weaving cloth, carving wood, telling stories. The longhouse, the great rectangular hall that was the basic unit of Norse domestic architecture, was a working building. Animals were sometimes kept at one end during winter, their body heat contributing to the warmth of the space. The family lived, ate, slept, and worked in the same long room, organized around a central hearth whose smoke rose through a hole in the roof. This is not a romantic image, it is a hard one. The Norse world was a world of genuine scarcity for most people, where a bad harvest could mean starvation, where infant mortality was high, where the average lifespan was considerably shorter than ours. The poetry and the mythology that the Norse produced were not created in comfortable circumstances. They were created by people who understood, in a very immediate way, what it meant to be mortal. The Norse relationship with fate, with what they called word in the related Old English tradition, or the concept of one's destined lot, was not passive resignation. It was something more like a fierce acceptance. You could not change what the Norns, the 3 figures who wove the threads of fate at the base of the world tree Yggdrasil, had written for you, but you could meet it well. You could face it without flinching. The worst thing in the Norse moral universe was not death. It was cowardice. It was the failure to show up fully for whatever life demanded. This value system produced the thing that outsiders found so unsettling about the Norse, a genuine indifference to risk that, in the right circumstances, translated into extraordinary boldness. The man who would sail into an unknown ocean, or attack a fortified town with a force a fraction of its size, or negotiate alone in a hostile court, he was not crazy. He was operating from a coherent moral framework in which bold action was intrinsically valuable, regardless of outcome. The skaldic poetry, the formal court poetry composed by professional Norse poets called skalds, is one of our best windows into this value system. Skalds composed elaborate, densely elusive verses in honor of their patrons, celebrating their military achievements and their generosity. The meters were extraordinarily complex. The language full of kennings, compressed metaphorical compounds that are one of the most distinctive features of Norse literary style. The sea was the whale road, gold was the fire of the Rhine, a warrior was the feeder of ravens, a sword was the wound snake. These kennings are not decorative. They are a way of seeing the world, a way of encoding multiple layers of meaning into a single compressed image. The Scald who called the sea the whale road was not just describing the sea. He was placing it in a web of associations, the great creatures that moved through it, the danger and the distance, the road that led somewhere worth going. The kenning asks the listener to do interpretive work, to bring their own knowledge and imagination to the image. It treats the audience as intelligent. The Eddic poetry, the mythological verse preserved in the Poetic Edda, is different in character, more direct, more narrative, concerned with the great stories of the gods and heroes. The Völuspá, the prophecy of the seeress, is perhaps the most extraordinary piece of Old Norse literature, a vision of the entire arc of the cosmos, from its creation to its destruction in Ragnarok and the possibility of renewal beyond. It is a poem of genuine philosophical ambition, grappling with questions of origin, meaning, and ending that are recognizably the same questions human beings have always asked. The fact that we have these texts at all is itself a remarkable story. They were preserved primarily in Iceland, written down in manuscripts produced in the 12th and 13th centuries. The man most responsible for their preservation was a 13th century Icelandic scholar and politician named Snorri Sturluson, who compiled the Prose Edda, a handbook of Norse mythology and skaldic technique, partly as a practical guide for poets who needed to understand the mythological references in older verse, and partly, it seems, out of genuine intellectual fascination with the tradition. Snorri was a Christian writing about pagan mythology, and he handled it with a combination of scholarly care and creative interpretation that has shaped how we understand Norse religion ever since. He was also, incidentally, one of the most powerful men in Iceland, deeply involved in the violent political conflicts of his era, and he was eventually assassinated in his own cellar. The man who preserved the Norse myths did not have a quiet life. The Icelandic sagas that Snorri's world produced are worth dwelling on because they represent something genuinely unusual in medieval literature. The family sagas, Njál's saga, Egil's saga, Laxdæla saga, and dozens of others, are prose narratives of remarkable sophistication, telling stories of Icelandic families across generations, tracing feuds and marriages and legal disputes and occasional violence with a cool, almost cinematic detachment. The saga style is spare. It does not tell you what characters are feeling. It shows you what they do and what they say, and leaves you to draw your own conclusions. Modern readers often find it startlingly contemporary. Njál's saga, probably the greatest of the family sagas, follows two families across 50 years of escalating conflict, driven by a combination of personal honor, legal maneuvering, and the kind of slow accumulation of grievances that ends in catastrophe. It contains some of the most memorable scenes in medieval literature, including the burning of Njál and his family in their farmhouse, which Njál faces with a composure that is either saintly or simply Norse, depending on how you read it. He refuses to leave. He lies down with his wife and pulls an oxhide over them both. When the fire is out and the attackers enter, they find him and his wife lying together, apparently unscathed by the flames, their faces peaceful. It is a scene that has haunted readers for 800 years. These sagas are not pure history. They are literary constructions shaped by the concerns and conventions of their time. But they preserve something real. The texture of a society that took law seriously, that valued eloquence and wit, that understood honor as a practical social necessity rather than an abstract virtue, and that was capable of extraordinary violence when the social fabric tore. The legal tradition of the Norse world is another underappreciated dimension of this culture. The Althing, the Icelandic parliament established around 930, was one of the earliest representative assemblies in the world. It met annually at Ingvellir, a dramatic rift valley where the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates meet, and it served as both a legislative body and a court. Laws were not written down at first. They were memorized and recited by the law speaker, whose job was to know the entire legal code and to recite 1/3 of it each year. The Althing resolved disputes, declared outlawry, the most severe punishment in a society without prisons, and provided a forum for the kind of elaborate legal maneuvering that the sagas depict with such relish. The Norse legal concept of outlawry is particularly fascinating. An outlaw, a person declared outside the law, lost all legal protections. Anyone could kill them without consequence. They could not receive food, shelter, or assistance from anyone without that person also becoming liable. It was, in effect, social death. And yet the sagas are full of outlaws who survive for years. living in the wilderness, supported by friends and family who risked the consequences. The law said one thing, human loyalty said another. The tension between those two imperatives is one of the great themes of saga literature. What the Norse legal tradition tells us, at bottom, is that this was a society that took the problem of order seriously, that understood the difference between a world governed by law and a world governed purely by force, and that preferred, on balance, the former. The raids and the violence that dominate the outside world's image of the Norse were real, but they existed alongside, and in tension with, a genuine commitment to legal process and communal governance that is at least as characteristic of Norse culture. The end of the Viking Age is usually dated to 10,066, the year of the Norman conquest of England, but also the year of the last major Norse invasion of England, when the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada sailed south with a large fleet, claiming the English throne, and was defeated and killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge by the English king Harold Godwinson. Harald Hardrada had spent years in the Varangian Guard, had fought across the Mediterranean, had accumulated wealth and reputation across the known world. He was, in many ways, the last of the great Viking Age figures, a man whose career spanned the entire Norse world, from Norway to Constantinople to the banks of the Derwent in Yorkshire, where he died with an arrow in his throat. 3 weeks after Stamford Bridge, William of Normandy landed in the south of England. Harold Godwinson, who had just marched his army north and back again at extraordinary speed, met the Normans at Hastings and lost. The world changed, but the Viking Age did not simply end in 1066. It faded. The Scandinavian kingdoms were by this point Christian, increasingly integrated into the European political order, developing the institutions of medieval monarchy that would define the next several centuries. The conditions that had produced the Viking Age, the particular combination of technological advantage, political fragmentation in target regions, internal pressure in Scandinavia, and the opportunistic culture of the Norse had changed. The longship was still a remarkable vessel, but the coastal defences of England and France had improved. The political consolidation of Scandinavia meant that Norse energy was increasingly channeled into the politics of kingdoms rather than the adventures of independent chieftains. The world the Vikings made, however, endured. In the DNA of populations from Iceland to Normandy, to the British Isles to Ukraine, Norse ancestry persists. In the languages of English and Russian and the Scandinavian tongues, Norse words and structures survive. In the place names of half a continent, Norse geography is written into the landscape. In the legal and political traditions of Iceland and England and Normandy, Norse institutions left their mark. And in the imagination of the modern world, the Vikings remain transformed, mythologized, sometimes grotesquely distorted, but pointing, always, towards something real. The appeal of the Norse world is not simply nostalgia for violence or a fantasy of freedom from constraint. At its best, it is a recognition of something genuinely admirable, the willingness to go beyond the known horizon, to face the unknown with skill and courage and a dark humor about the odds, to make something beautiful, a ship, a poem, a legal code, a city, out of the raw materials of a hard world. The monk on the shore at Lindisfarne in 793 saw the longships and felt terror. That terror was real, and the suffering that followed was real, but the ships themselves, those extraordinary, improbable vessels that could cross oceans and navigate rivers and beach on any shore, those were also real. And they carried, along with the warriors, a civilization that deserves to be understood on its own terms. Complicated, capable, and more human than the myth has ever quite managed to capture. That is the truth about the Vikings. Not the horned helmets, not the pure savagery, not the pure heroism either. The truth is the runestone in the field, the kenning carved into memory, the shallow draft hull bending in the Atlantic swell, the law speaker standing at Ingvalir reciting the code from memory while the sun moves across the Icelandic sky. The truth is Ulf, who went to England 3 times and came home. If you have made it this far, thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of history this channel exists to tell, the story underneath the story, the complicated truth behind the powerful myth. If something in this video shifted how you think about the Norse world, drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and the conversations that happen down there are consistently the best part of running this channel. If you are not subscribed yet, now is a good moment. Hit the subscribe button and the bell notification so you do not miss what comes next. because the next video goes deep into the Varangian Guard, the Norse warriors who served the Byzantine emperors and fought their way across the medieval world from Constantinople to Sicily. It is one of the most extraordinary untold stories of the Viking Age, and it is coming very soon. And if you want to go even further back, to the world that made the Norse possible, to the Bronze Age Scandinavians who were already building sophisticated ships 2,000 years before Lindisfarne, that video is already waiting for you on this channel. The link is on screen now. The horizon is always out there. Let us keep sailing toward it,